It's looking like the GPU situation is about to be dire, so what should you do? Should you buy in right now? We'll talk in this video, but first, what is the updates? I'd already reported that NVIDIA was going to be prioritizing 8GB cards soon, and we could see price increases even on those models, but today we got additional information. Hardware Unboxed has talked to a lot of suppliers, including Asus, who directly told them that 5070 Ti's are basically unavailable from NVIDIA right now, and we got additional information on other cards in the lineup as well. But Hardware Unboxed is not the only source of this information. I also found at videocards.com an article talking about NVIDIA's new GeForce RTX 50 allocation scheme prioritizing the top SKU in each memory tier, and their source is not Hardware Unboxed for this. It's actually coming from HKEPC, so this is another source of similar information. They're claiming, similar to what Hardware Unboxed was saying, that in each memory tier, so not in performance tier, but each memory class, the more expensive model will be prioritized. So, for example, between the 5060 and the 5060 Ti 8GB, NVIDIA is going to prioritize VRAM supply for the 5060 Ti 8GB version. It's unclear, both from Hardware Unboxed and this source, what's going to go on with the 5070. Because it's 12GB, not 16, perhaps it will fare better than the 16GB models, where the 5060 Ti 16GB is going to be deprioritized, possibly not supplied at all for a while. The 5070 Ti, same issue, whereas the 16GB card that makes the largest margins for NVIDIA, which is the 5080, will get the prioritization for supply. So 5060 Ti 16GB, 5070 Ti could be out of the market coming soon once the supply that's already in stores is gone. Now, there doesn't seem to be any word about 5090s or the D versions or D versions 2 for the China region having any reduction in supply, but we've already seen that prices on those are pretty insane anyway. We also have some additional information, this coming from Megasize GPU, who has leaked things in the past that indicate he does seem to have some sort of sources within either board partners or NVIDIA or somewhere in that supply chain, saying that NVIDIA GPU supply to AIC. AICs are places like Asus or MSI or Gigabyte or whatever, where they get the chip and memory from NVIDIA, then they put it on a PCB, stick a cooler on it, and sell it to the stores, and then you buy it from the stores from them. So the add-in card partners, the AICs, he's saying that NVIDIA GPU supply has been cut down 15 to 20%, saying the good news is that NVIDIA still bundles a GPU with memory, so the add-in card partners aren't having to negotiate memory themselves, but the bad news is that there will be no new product in 2026. So he's claiming that would probably be killing off the Super Series. Now, in the Hardware Unboxed video, they said that, the Super Series is at least canceled for now. It had originally been planned for CES, and so a lot of the board partners had planned big CES presentations, but then got the rug pulled out from under them when NVIDIA decided not to go with the Super Series, because the main factor, the main reason to buy a Super Series card was more VRAM, but that's too expensive now. It no longer makes sense economically, so they canceled that. But in this video, they mentioned, could it come out later this year if prices stabilize? Maybe, but if it gets too close to the 60 series launch, it would no longer make sense. So anyway, we'll have to see what comes of that. Basically, the only reason we'd see a Super Series if VRAM situation pricing-wise got a lot better anytime soon. So that's where we're at. So what does that mean for you? So I think we need to look at what are prices for graphics cards right now, and then we need to figure out, is it worth jumping in now or waiting for things to get worse or wait for the 60 series? And I also think it's important to mention, if you are currently happy with the performance of your graphics card, you don't need to upgrade, so you can wait. It's looking like GPU generations are getting longer in those cycles. So the amount of time you can stay on your current graphics card has been extending. From the consumer point of view, that can be a silver lining, at least from the perspective of using your same GPU for longer, as opposed to, there's the alternative of, well, I would like games to advance graphically, etc. Well, that might get a little bit harder. But again, people looking for the silver lining here is we might not be pushing the spec that people expect game developers expect people to have in their system because the market could go bad like this. Anyway, let's check in on pricing. So first, let's look at the NVIDIA lineup. The RTX 5050 right now, I can still find models at $240 in stock, which is actually $10 below MSRP. Now, does it make sense to buy that? The 5050 is not super powerful. I've done a lot of my own reviews, which you can check on my channel, but for the sake of convenience to discuss things quickly in this video, I'm going to pull up the Tech Power Up relative performance chart where you can select a specific graphics card, set it as the baseline, and look how others scale from there. Now, I will be clear that individual dedicated reviews to these cards are generally more accurate than just pulling up this relative performance chart, but it's better than not having anything. So the 5050 is one of the 8GB cards, and it hasn't been mentioned in any of these leaks on what might happen with that. Now, it's basically the same performance as a 4060. It's slightly lower, although being a 50 series card, it supports multi-frame gen. Anyway, so it's similar in performance to like a 2080, RX 6650 XT, 7600 XT. So if you're already anywhere in this similar ballpark, even a 2070 Super, or heck, even a 1080 Ti, although that wouldn't support DLSS, you're not too far off here. It's not even much of an upgrade on a 3060, and it would be a VRAM downgrade. So, okay, the 5050 is not currently above its MSRP, and supply is available, but is it worth upgrading to? There's a big question mark on that, right? Now, the RTX 5060 is currently actually still available at its MSRP of $300, and even a model looks like $10 below at $290. Now, how do those scale? The 5050 up to the 5060, that's about 27% more performance. Now, how does the pricing scale? Well, we're currently looking at the lowest prices being $290 versus $240 because we had one $10 below MSRP. So it's currently only 21% more money to get almost 30% more performance. So it does not, in my opinion, make any sense to buy an RTX 5050 at current pricing from a price to performance ratio. Now, that doesn't necessarily even mean that the 5060 is the card to buy, although at least it's not currently over its MSRP. Because we could also, 5060 Ti, the 8GB version, this is the one that we're expecting to have supply prioritized for, so it might be able to stay around its current pricing. We'll have to see, though. There's currently at least one model available at $330, so let's look at what makes sense between the 5060 and the 5060 Ti, if anything. So we've already established the 5060 is better price per performance on the current market than the 5050. We set the 5060 as the baseline, and then look up the 5060 Ti 8GB version, you're only getting about 15% more performance. Let's look at price. So we're looking at $330 for the Ti version versus $290 in the current market, lowest price on the non-Ti version. So about 14% more money for 15% more performance. In other words, the 5060 Ti 8GB and 5060 offer about the same price to performance, and they both offer better price to performance than the 5050 on the current market. Now, let's look at the AMD competition at these price points. So the 9060 XT version has an 8GB version available at $310. And it offers similar performance to the 5060 Ti 8GB version, although when you're VRAM limited, it sometimes performs better because it has 16 lanes of PCIe, whereas the NVIDIA alternative has only 8, and when you're spilling over VRAM capacity, more information passes over the PCIe bus. So in VRAM limited situations, the 9060 XT is potentially a better option. How much is the 16GB version currently? Unfortunately, this is where things are hitting us. It's jumped up to $400. For a lot of months towards the end of 2025, you were able to find these for as low as around $350. So this has certainly jumped in price, and it suddenly makes that 16GB coming in at a pretty significant premium. That's almost $100 more than the 8GB version. We're about $90 more here. How about the 5060 Ti 16GB version on the current market? So on the current market, that has jumped all the way up to $450. So yikes, this VRAM situation seems to already be hitting us. And based on what we're seeing here, that is likely going to get worse for the pricing on these 16 gigabyte models. And again, the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte might not even re-enter the market. So suddenly we're in a situation where you have to make some really hard choices, right? If you want a 16 gigabyte graphics card, it's looking like that 9060 XT 16 gigabyte is gonna be the way in, and it's at $400. From a price to performance standpoint, when you're not VRAM limited, that looks really bad compared to the 8 gigabyte cards like the 9060 XT 8 gigabyte. And even the NVIDIA alternative there with the 5060 and 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte version. So price to performance wise, those 8 gigabyte cards, due to the current market, offer you more for your money. Now, I've done a lot of 8 gigabyte VRAM testing videos. You can feel free to look on my channel for those. And my general take is you can play every new game on an 8 gigabyte graphics card, but you sometimes have to reduce the settings, and sometimes fairly significantly. So ultra settings in most new games go over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, often even at 1080p resolution. That being said, if you're playing mostly esports games, older games, or you're fine-tuning down some graphics settings, these 8 gigabyte cards are suddenly, not that I really want to recommend them, but in the current market, they suddenly become like, well, it's harder to justify the additional expense of the 16 gigabyte card. It's still better to get those if it's in your budget for a long-term gaming perspective. And this is where I really have to highlight, don't just jump into an 8 gigabyte graphics card because you just feel the rush to buy right now, right? Remember, these cards, these 8 gigabyte cards, like the 5060, 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte, 9060 XT 8 gigabyte, that kind of stuff. Like if we look at the 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte here, if we look at the relative performance, think about the card you might already have. So if you're already on like a 3070 or something like that, this is not much of an upgrade and you're still locked into 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So consider the card you're already on. If you're happy with your current performance, or at least you could suffer through it longer, I think trying to wait out the VRAM apocalypse might be the way to go. But if you're desperate to upgrade, then things might get worse soon. And if you have to buy right now and those 16 gigabyte cards left your price range, unfortunately, you might have to look at one of those 8 gigabyte models from a price to performance standpoint. And again, I'm trying to be honest with you about the situation there. You can play new games, you just will have to turn down settings in many, many, many new games in order to not have issues with the 8 gigabytes of VRAM. That being said, you can turn down settings enough for it not to be an issue, at least in current games. Let's check in on the next class up. So the 5070 has a $550 MSRP, and it is currently available at that price, and I even see one model that is $10 below. So that's where that's at. Now, the AMD alternative is the 9070, which is currently at $590. Now, the 9070 is a 16 gigabyte card, and the 5070 is only a 12 gigabyte card. The 9070 is also a little bit faster. It's about tied in ray tracing, and it falls behind in path tracing. And there's also just the general NVIDIA feature set advantage, but the 9070 in general is a bit faster than a 5070. If I set the 5070 as the baseline here, you're looking at an additional 10% performance or so. Depending on the games you benchmark, it might be 15%, might be. But I usually get about 10 to 15% faster in most games. And again, about tied in ray tracing, it falls behind in path tracing. So let's think about the value proposition there. So we're looking at $590 versus the lowest model I saw was $540. So $590 divided by 540. So currently, if you buy the AMD version, you're spending 9% more money for 10% more performance. In other words, they offer about exactly the same price to performance, but the NVIDIA card does give you better path tracing performance. DLSS is a better upscaler. You get multi-frame generation, even if you just use ×2 frame generation. NVIDIA's frame generation has better frame pacing, and NVIDIA tends to push new features faster than AMD does. That being said, the AMD card does have FSR4, which is a very good upscaler, even if DLSS is a little bit better. Also, you do get a form of frame generation, even if it's ×2 and with a bit worse frame pacing. You also get, like I said, the biggest thing is the 16 gigabytes of VRAM instead of the 12. That's the main thing you get. So you get a very usable card, 10%, but about the same price performance. Generally, most people kind of consider the NVIDIA feature set worth spending an extra 20% or so. So in this case, these cards are offering the same price to performance. AMD is not outclassing the price to performance here, so that's a bit rough from the AMD perspective. That being said, the 9070 gets you 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and so I'm guessing that its price might be about to get a whole heck of a lot worse. It was recently available at closer to its MSRP of $550, and it has already gone up. I'm expecting that could get worse. We haven't seen a bunch of leaks about the AMD side of this, but in general, we've seen leaks that just say AMD, all of their GPUs might be going up in price, something like 10 or 15% to what they were previously. Now, how's the XT version doing from AMD? Okay, now this is coming in at $700. It had dropped occasionally as low as its MSRP of $600, but this is, a similar price to where it's hung out a lot of its lifespan. And its direct performance alternative is the 5070 Ti. The 5070 Ti has an MSRP of $750, and it's been widely available at that price for months now. Unfortunately, it's jumped up to $830 at the lowest model, and then immediately up to $880. So now the 5070 Ti is kind of out of the conversation for the most part, and I doubt this model is going to last long. And according to all of this information, it could be a long time, if ever, before it's restocked. So the 5070 Ti is kind of exiting the market. That suddenly puts the 9070 XT in a bit of a new light. It's suddenly at $700, I think the only high-end GPU that I consider to make any sort of a financial sense. The 5080, for example, is already up to $1,300, and this is the model that the rumors are saying is going to continue to get restocked supply from NVIDIA. 5070 Ti and 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte, rumor is they're not getting restocked. And again, with multiple sources claiming that, and they're claiming the information directly from AIB partners who say they got it directly from NVIDIA, this is, as leaks and rumors go, something I would put a lot of stock into. So how does this play out? So setting the 5070 is the baseline. So if you're willing to spend $540 on this, is it worth spending a bit more? Again, if you go up 10% in price, you get 10% more performance on the 9070. You also get up to 16 gigabytes of VRAM, but lose out on some feature set. If your budget could jump up to $700, you now get the 9070 XT, which they have at about 23% more performance. So let's look at that consideration. So 700 versus 540. You're spending about 30% more money for less than a 30% performance increase. And again, you're also losing the NVIDIA feature set, but you're getting 16 gigabytes of VRAM. So the 9070 XT at this price point isn't like I think rush out and buy it kind of an offer. That being said, if you want more performance than a 5070, the 9070 XT gets you a noticeable jump, whereas the 9070 is a little bit of a harder sell. 10% sometimes noticeable, but not always. 23%, you might actually notice that in a lot of situations. So from that perspective, while it is diminishing returns, I think there's the argument that it's at least enough of a performance jump that it gets you to a new class. So what's my overall recommendation here? Well, like I said, the going beyond the 9070 XT in performance suddenly jumps up to $1,300. So that gets really stupid, right? If we set the 9070 XT as the baseline, the 5080 is not that much more powerful. Tech Power Up has it about 20% more powerful than a 9070 XT. Now, you do get a lot more path tracing performance, and you do get the NVIDIA feature set, and they both have 16 gigabytes of VRAM, but it used to be that the 5070 Ti was the sweet spot in terms of getting all getting the 16 gigabytes of VRAM and the NVIDIA feature set, and the 5080 was a hard sell with diminishing returns. And that's when the 5080 was available at $1,000. When it's $1,300, you're suddenly saying, okay, 20% more performance than a 9070 XT. Okay, also the feature set stuff, but we're talking $1,300 versus $700. You're talking almost double the price. So the 5080 costs almost double the price of a 9070 XT, and is only a bit more performance, and then you get the NVIDIA feature set. So I'd got to say, the 5080 is a really hard sell. It doesn't make any sense from a value proposition. The 9070 XT itself is already struggling a bit from a price to performance standpoint against cards like the 5070, but it at least has only small diminishing returns, whereas the 5080 is just awful, and the 5070 Ti seems to be exiting the market. So now the 5070 Ti, if you could still grab one at its current $830 minimum, and you just want the NVIDIA alternative to the 9070 XT before it's gone, this does make more sense than a 5080 at $1,300. So in other words, if you're looking at the higher end of the market, the 5080 is awful price to performance. I can't recommend it. The 5070 Ti at $830 is a bit of a tough sell, considering we used to be able to get it at $750 pretty easily, but it at least makes more sense than the 5080, and this might be one of your last chances to grab one at all. The 9070 XT versus those high-end NVIDIA options actually makes some value sense at $700, but you just really have to ask yourself, would you be happy with a 5070 and save a lot of money? You drop to 12 gigabytes of VRAM, but you do save a lot of money. 9070 XT is a bit more powerful though. So I've got to say, 5070, as long as it's still around its MSRP in the current market, considering everything else is getting more expensive, I don't hate the 5070. So I think for a lot of people, if you're like, look, I'm not interested in the AMD options. I just want to stick with NVIDIA. 12 gigabytes isn't the end of the world, and you're going to have a good experience at 1440p here. The AMD options are worth considering, okay? Especially if you want something a bit more powerful than this, and the 5070 Ti's are dried up and a 5080 is ridiculously expensive. So I could recommend a 9070 XT for people looking for something more powerful and with 16 gigabytes of VRAM than the 5070. The 5070 is going to be probably my kind of go-to recommendation for somebody who doesn't want an 8 gigabyte card. So if you can afford more than the 8 gigabyte cards, I think jumping up to a 5070 makes sense, and there can be some justification for going up to a 9070 XT. Below this, yeah, you're kind of stuck on those 8 gigabyte cards. That's a bit rough in the current market. You might check the used market, see if that's not gone insane yet or anything like that. But that's where we're at. Remember, my overall recommendation is if your current performance is getting you by, you might try to wait out the VRAM Apocalypse. But if you are needing to upgrade and you just haven't done it yet, but you're like, I really need to, I can't make it another year or two, because again, the VRAM situation could be years. I'm not saying this is going to be a fast fix. Then now is probably better than what you're going to see throughout the rest of this year. I can't guarantee that, but that's what all the rumors are pointing to. So if you need to make a jump to an upgrade, now might be better than later. But if you don't have to upgrade, things look worse now than they did just a couple of months ago. So if you didn't upgrade then, I'm not trying to tell you to just rush out and upgrade now just because things are getting bad. So be clear on what I'm saying here. Like I said, if you're looking at those 8 gigabyte cards, the 9060 XT is interesting in that it still gets you the 16 gigabytes of PCIe lanes. So that might be my favored 8 gigabyte card there. But the 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte version also, might be worth considering at only a little bit more money. You get the NVIDIA feature set, but you lose out on the PCIe lanes. So worth thinking about there. If you definitely are going to tune your games to stay within the 8 gigabyte buffer and not need to spill across the PCIe lanes, then the 5060 Ti does get you the NVIDIA feature set and a little bit more performance too compared to the 9060 XT. So those would kind of be a split recommendation for me if you're going to jump into the 8GB cards. And that's what I've got for you guys today. The market looks rough. Hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting. Wish I had better news for you. But I still hope you all have an excellent day.